This is Lesson 4 Part A of Youth by Isaac Asimov, and today's learning intention is to learn about perspectives in narrative writing. And your success criteria today are to explain how a change in narrative perspective changes the way we view characters and events in a story, and to be able to explain how different perspectives make a story more interesting, as well as creating a story of your own with different perspectives. First, the chapter. I'm going to be reading chapter 3 today, but again, as always, you don't have to listen to my voice anymore. You can, well, you do because it's on the next video as well, but you don't have to listen to me read the chapter. You can read that yourself if you just head over to the next video after you're done for the tasks. If you don't want to listen to me, I'll see you over there, but for the rest of us, here is chapter 3. The Swain had come to a halt and it was dark. The explorer was not comfortable in the alien air. It felt as thick as soup, and he had to breathe shallowly. Even so, he reached out in a sudden need for company. The merchant was warm to the touch. His breathing was rough. He moved in an occasional spasm and was obviously asleep. The explorer hesitated and decided not to wake him. It would serve no real purpose. There would be no rescue, of course. That was the penalty paid for the high profits which unrestrained competition could lead to. The merchant who opened a new planet could have a 10-year monopoly of its trade, which he might hug to himself or, more likely, rent out to all comers at a stiff price. It followed that planets were searched for in secrecy, and preferably away from the usual trade routes. In a case such as theirs, then, there was little or no chance that another ship would come within range of their sub-etherics, except for the most improbable of coincidences. Even if they were in their ship, that is, rather than this cage. The explorer grasped the thick bars. Even if they blasted those away, as they could, they would be stuck too high in the open air for leaping. It was too bad. He had landed twice before in the scout ship. They had established contact with the natives, who were grotesquely huge but mild and unaggressive. It was obvious that they had once owned a flourishing technology but hadn't faced up to the consequences of such a technology. It would have been a wonderful market. It was a tremendous world. The merchant especially had been taken aback. He had known the figures that expressed the planet's diameter, but from a distance of 2 light seconds he had stood at the visiplate and muttered, "Unbelievable." "Oh, there are larger worlds," the explorer said. It wouldn't do for an explorer to be too easily impressed. "Inhabited? Well, no. Why, you could drop your planet into that large ocean and drown it." The explorer smiled. It was a gentle dig at his Arcturian homeworld, which was smaller than most planets. He said, "Not quite." The merchant followed along the line of his thoughts. "And the inhabitants are large in proportion to their world?" He sounded as though the news struck him less favourably now. "Nearly 10 times our height." "Are you sure they are friendly?" "That is hard to say. Friendship between alien intelligences is an imponderable. They are not dangerous, I think. We've come across other groups that could not maintain equilibrium after the atomic war stage, and you know the results. Introversion, retreat, gradual decadence, and increasing gentleness. Even if they are such monsters, the principle remains." It was about then that the explorer felt the heavy throbbing of the engines. He frowned and said, "We are descending a bit too quickly." There had been some speculation on the dangers of landing some hours before. The planetary target was a huge one for an oxygen water world, though it lacked the size of uninhabitable hydrogen-ammonia planets, and its low density made its surface gravity fairly normal. Its gravitational forces fell off but slowly with distance. In short, its gravitational potential was high, and the ship's calculator was a run-of-the-mill model not designed to plot landing trajectories at that potential range. That meant the pilot would have to use manual controls. It would have been wiser to install a more high-powered model, but that would have meant a trip to some outpost of civilization, lost time, perhaps a lost secret. The merchant demanded an immediate landing. The merchant felt it necessary to defend his position now. He said angrily to the explorer, "Don't you think the pilot knows his job? He landed you safely twice before." Yes, thought the explorer, in a scout ship, not this unmanoeuvrable freighter. Aloud, he said nothing. He kept his eye on the visiplate. They were descending too quickly. There was no room for doubt. Much too quickly. The merchant said peevishly, "Why do you keep silence?" "Well then, if you wish me to speak, I would suggest that you strap on your floater and help me prepare the ejector." The pilot fought a noble fight. He was no beginner. The atmosphere, abnormally high and thick in the gravitational potential of this world, whipped and burned about the ship, but to the very last it looked as though he might bring it under control despite that. He even maintained course, following the extrapolated line to the point on the northern continent towards which they were headed. Under other circumstances, with a shade more luck, the story would eventually have been told and retold as a heroic and masterly reversal of a lost situation. But within sight of victory, tired body and tired nerves clamped a control bar with a shade too much pressure. The ship, which had almost levelled off, dipped down again. There was no room to retrieve the final error. There was only a mile left to fall. The pilot remained at his post to the actual landing, his only thought that of breaking the force of the crash, of maintaining the spaceworthiness of the vessel. He did not survive. With the ship bucking madly in a soupy atmosphere, few ejectors could be mobilised, and only one of them in time. When, afterwards, the explorer lifted out of unconsciousness and rose to his feet, he had the definite feeling that, but for himself and the merchant, there were no survivors. And perhaps that was an overcalculation. His floater had burned out while still sufficiently distant from the surface to have the fall stun him. The merchant might have had less luck even than that. He was surrounded by a world of thick, ropey stalks of grass, and in the distance were trees that reminded him vaguely of similar structures on his native Arcturian world, except that their lowest branches were high above what he would consider normal treetops. He called, his voice sounding basso in the thick air, and the merchant answered. The explorer made his way towards him, thrusting violently at the coarse stalks that barred his path. "Are you hurt?" he asked. The merchant grimaced. "I've sprained something. It hurts to walk." The explorer probed gently. "I don't think anything is broken. You'll have to walk despite the pain. Can't we rest first?" "It's important to try and find the ship. If it's space-worthy, or it can be repaired, we may live. Otherwise we won't." "Just a few minutes. Let me catch my breath." The explorer was glad enough for those minutes. The merchant's eyes were already closed. He allowed his to do the same. He heard the trampling and his eyes snapped open. Never sleep on a strange planet, he told himself futilely. The merchant was awake too, and his steady screaming was a rumble of terror. The explorer called, "It's only a native of this planet. It won't harm you." But even as he spoke, the giant had swooped down, and in a moment they were in its grasp, being lifted closer to its monstrous ugliness. The merchant struggled violently, and of course quite futilely. "Can't you talk to it?" he yelled. The explorer could only shake his head. "I can't reach it with the projector. It won't be listening." "Then blast it! Blast it down!" "We can't do that." The phrase, "you fool," had almost been added. The explorer struggled to keep his self-control. They were swallowing space as the monster moved purposefully away. "Why not?" cried the merchant. "You can reach your blaster. I can see it in plain sight. Don't be afraid of falling." "It's simpler than that. If this monster is killed, you'll never trade with this planet. You'll never even leave it. You probably won't live the day out." "Why? Why?" "Because this is one of the young of the species. You should know what happens when a trader kills a native young, even accidentally. What's more, if this is the target point, then we are in the estate of a powerful native. This might be one of his brood." That was how they entered their present prison. They had carefully burned away a portion of the thick, stiff covering, and it was obvious that the height from which they were suspended was a killing one. Now, once again, the prison cage shuddered and lifted in an upward arc. The merchant rolled to the lower rim and startled awake. The cover lifted and light flooded in. As was the case the time before, there were two specimens of the young. They were not very different in appearance from the adults of the species, reflected the explorer, though, of course, they were considerably smaller. A handful of reedy green stalks was stuffed between the bars. Its odour was not unpleasant, but it carried clods of soil at its ends. The merchant drew away and said huskily, "What are they doing?" The merchant said, "Trying to feed us, I should judge. At least this seems to be the native equivalent of grass." The cover was replaced, and they were set swinging again, alone with their fodder. So that was chapter 3. I hope you enjoyed it. I really like that chapter, partially because I don't have to do any of the accents, partially because I think it's a really great twist to see things from that new perspective. Let's go talk about that some more over on video part B.